What's going on there, YouTube? Welcome back to another comic book video. Okay, so we're going to do a full story video. A full story video is when I sit down and take a bunch of videos that tell one overarching story and combine them together into one big video. Now, today's full story video is going to be about the X-Cutioner Song. It was a crazy X-Men event, but also it was the first X-Men crossover that did not have Chris Claremont nor Jim Lee on the actual book. It was written by a new crew coming together to hopefully lead the X-Men into the 1990s era. But also, we begin the whole big love for Cable, but also the character known as Strife as well. It is one heck of a crossover. And so, guys, I do hope you enjoy today's full story video. Here we go. Guys, we are finally here. We are finally here. The X-Cutioner Song crossover. And this is going to be amazing. Guys, I am so pumped for this crossover. Now, with that being said, when it comes to the X-Cutioner Song, it is a 13-part crossover, technically only 12. The 13th part is really more of a epilogue, more like an aftermath book. But I still want to go ahead and throw that book into our actual coverage over the entire crossover. Now, today's video, we're only covering the first two chapters. And here's the reason why. Because a lot of stuff happens in just the first two chapters of this crossover. You are talking about the idea of Cable trying to kill off Charles Xavier. You are talking about the idea of X-Factor fighting against X-Force. You are talking about the idea of the possibility of Apocalypse coming back, but also because, well, his horsemen are here as well. Like, there are so many different moving pieces happening at once in just the first two chapters of this crossover. So, today's video, we're only covering the first two chapters that came from Uncanny X-Men and also X-Factor. The next video, I'll try to cover more than just two chapters. But yeah, guys, let's go ahead and dive into this crazy event. So the first chapter takes place in Uncanny X-Men issue number 294. Now, in the opening pages of this chapter, we do pick up with Archangel. Now, when it comes to Archangel, he's currently using a image inducer to make himself look normal because, again, when he was Archangel, he had blue skin and his wings did not look, well, not that nice looking. But around his time in Marvel Comics, he was dating a woman known as Charlotte Jones. Now, Charlotte Jones had just lost her husband a while back, who was a police officer. And so after losing her husband, she had quit her job as a nurse and became a police officer, but to also kind of get more money as well. Either way, she had begun dating Archangel, and the two characters about to head over to a concert, a very important concert that's going to begin everything for this crossover. Also, we see Archangel trying to, have some fun time the limo on the way over to the actual concert. But now we jump over to the concert, and we do learn that the actual concert for is a character known as Lila Cheney. Now, we had actually talked about Lila before. You see, Lila was kind of like Dazzler, a big-time pop star. I want to say she's a rock star instead. Either way, for Lila, she is also a mutant, but she's a big-time teleporter. Now, the reason why she had called this concert at Central Park is to bring all her fans together into one location, but to also allow Charles Xavier to give out a powerful speech about the idea of humans and mutants living together in harmony. Now, there is something else I do want to mention. You see, when it comes to Charles Xavier, the public does not know that he is actually a mutant. To the public, they still believe that he is just a regular human who has a big goal for humans and mutants to live together. Now, with that being said, you do have Lila being very excited about Charles Xavier's speech. Now, in the outside area of the concert, you have different members of the X-Men on guard to make sure nothing happens to Charles Xavier. The problem is, something is about to happen to Charles Xavier very soon. And really, as we go underneath the stage, we actually pick up with two people trying to set bombs to blow up right underneath Charles and Lila to hopefully kill them off as well. Now, here's the big thing, because while he had those two guys trying to set up those bombs, they are then killed off by Cable. And it's Cable saying nobody else is going to kill off Charles Xavier except for me. And it's kind of like, okay, so Cable has the mission, and that is a big problem. Now, the next thing we have to talk about would be really more of Cyclops and Jean Grey. Let me explain. You see, these two characters are supposed to be in a very strong, healthy relationship, but you have Cyclops constantly thinking about Psylocke, and that is really important. And the reason why, because while he's sitting there thinking of Jean, he's also thinking about Psylocke and how he kind of wants to be with her. And for Jean Grey, her mind is always connected to Cyclops' mind. And so she was able to realize what he was thinking about. And for Jean Grey, she kind of feels like Cyclops is slowly moving away from her and trying to get with Psylocke. And what's crazy is, like, in 10 years, he will basically leave Jean Grey for Emma Frost. But either way, it's now these two characters getting into a small argument. Now, Cyclops and Jean Grey, they're at a diner, but across the street, you have Iceman and Colossus at the grocery store doing some grocery shopping. Now, this is Iceman also telling us that Opal, his girlfriend, is kind of wanting to spend some time away from him. So we're starting to move away from Iceman and Opal being in a relationship with one another. Now, for Iceman, he also wants to see if Colossus want to sit down and actually talk, because in our last video for the Uncanny X-Men, for Colossus, he had just lost his brother Mikhail. And so for Iceman, he want to see if Colossus is actually okay, or if he needs someone to actually talk to. But for Colossus, he's kind of like, no, I do not want to talk at all about the death of my brother. Now, there is something else I do want to talk about, and that'll be Gambit and Storm, because you have the two characters also at the concert, right? Now, recently for Storm, she had just broken up with Forge, and so she is now a single woman again. Now, in recent videos, it did seem like maybe her and Bishop might actually end up together, but right now, she's still single. Now, for Gambit, it does seem like he's trying to be that good friend, like, hey, he got word that her and Forge had broken up, and he want to be there for her, be that good friend. But at the same time, it still seems like Gambit is somewhat flirting with Storm, kind of like, hey, I heard you're single now, and you know what? I'm also single, and my wife is apparently dead now, so like, what's the move? Now, at the same time, it's still him trying to be that good friend, but also seems like, hey, you're single, I'm single, let's see where this could possibly go. And we also have to remember about X-Factor and their actual position in the world at this time in Marvel Comics. You see, for X-Factor, they were the government team, because with the American government, they wanted to hopefully build relations with the mutant race. And so what they did was they put together a team of mutants that basically work for the American government, but hoping that it would actually build some kind of relations between the government and also the mutant race. And it's being led by Havoc, the brother of Cyclops. But now it's time for us to get into the actual action of the book, because we now pick up with Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, you do have Cyclops being able to reassure Jean Grey that he's not trying to leave her. Like, yes, he may think about Psylocke, he might find Psylocke very attractive, but he does not want her. He only wants Jean Grey. Now, once he's able to reassure her, well, that is when our heroes are attacked by Caliban. Caliban. Now, Caliban we have not seen in a good while. Caliban used to be a Morlock. And remember, Morlocks were a group of mutants who lived underneath New York because when they gained their mutant abilities, well, their body had changed to the point where they were no longer able to hide in the public. Now, for Caliban, he did leave the Morlocks after the mutant massacre, and he did join X Factor for a short period of time, but he also joined Apocalypse side, and really, he became one of the horsemen for Apocalypse. Now, for Caliban, it does seem like he's still working for Apocalypse, and that is why he's here to attack Jean Grey and Cyclops. But the problem is, the last time our heroes saw Apocalypse, they thought they got rid of him. And so they're very confused on why in the world Caliban's here right now trying to attack them. But now we are able to jump back over to the concert. Now, you have Lila being able to wrap up her performance. But right after she does that, she introduced Charles Xavier to the crowd of people. Now, some of the people, they love Charles Xavier. But the other people, they don't like Charles Xavier because, again, he's trying to build up the future world where mutants and humans can live together. And the people who don't like him are the ones who truly do hate mutants. But while you have the concert going on, and while you have Cyclops and Jean Grey battling against Caliban, like I said earlier, across the street, you had Iceman and Colossus just doing some grocery shopping, except they realized something is happening with Cyclops and Jean Grey. And they tried their best to go over there to help out, but the problem is they are confronted by two of the horsemen of Apocalypse, and that will be War and Famine. And so you have those two horsemen of Apocalypse begin to fight against Colossus and Iceman. So now everything is beginning to pop off, but we still got some more things to come very soon in this chapter. Like I said earlier, the whole idea of Cable trying to kill off Charles Xavier, because you have Charles out there just trying his best to give out his speech about what he is trying to build, what he wants to see from both humans and mutants. But while he's on stage, again, trying to give out this speech, you have a few people just booing at him. You have a few people cheering him on. But then you have Cable pull out his gun, point his gun right at Charles Xavier, and bam, just like that, Cable had just shot Charles Xavier in front of the crowd of people who were there for the concert. The X-Men began to freak out because now it seems like Charles Xavier might have possibly just been killed off by Cable. Now, getting back over to the battle between Jean Grey and Cyclops fighting against Caliban, well, it's a very short-lived battle because Caliban is just too strong for our heroes. Now, for Cyclops and Jean Grey, they're trying their best to actually reason with Caliban, but at the same time trying their best to defend themselves against him. But like I said, he's too powerful. And so by the end of the section, you have two things happen. The first is that Caliban tells us that he is now the horseman of death. But the other thing is Jean Grey and Cyclops, they lose and they are easily captured by Caliban. Now, for Iceman and Colossus, they're still fighting against the other two horsemen. Now, that battle also does get wrapped up very quickly, but it does go in a different way, meaning that you do have the heroes being able to actually defeat both the two horsemen of Apocalypse, but you have the two characters teleport away back to the base of Apocalypse. But now for Colossus and Iceman, they're kind of wondering what in the world is going on here, but also, where is Jean Grey and Cyclops at? But now we have to jump back over to the concert. Now, when we do, we actually see Archangel trying to go after Cable for what Cable has done to Charles Xavier. But the problem is, you have Cable just disappear soon after you have Archangel trying to go after him. Now, once you have Cable leave, you have everybody rushing over to see if Charles Xavier is alive. Now, luckily he is alive, but he is severely injured. And so we're kind of left to wonder, will Charles actually survive this kind of injury? Now, the last two pages are really setting up the next chapter that we are going to talk about. The whole idea of X-Force fighting against X-Factor, because we jump back over to X-Force. And remember, when it came to the early days of X-Force, they were being led by Cable. Now, Cable had left the team to go after Mr. Tolliver, a different character who right now is not really involved in this crossover. But Cable had basically left the team, and you had Cannonball take up the position as leader of X-Force. And so currently you have X-Force trying their best to get any kind of connection to the real world. And when they do, they get word of what had just happened to Charles Xavier. The whole idea that, well, he had just been shot and right now he's barely surviving. And so for X-Force, they're kind of wondering what to do, because now the word on the street is it was Cable, their old leader. And so now we jump into X Factor issue number 84. Now, we do pick up with X-Force kind of wondering, like, what should they do here? Because they're now getting word that their old leader, Cable, has gone crazy and just tried to kill off, well, Charles Xavier. And so for X-Force, they kind of decided that it's really up to them to bring down their old leader. Now, for X-Force, they're also outlaws, because let's not forget that X-Force was kind of like the team that was more aggressive. They were not really afraid to kill off people if they have to kill off somebody. And so for X-Force, around this time in Marvel Comics, they had broken a lot of laws. And so they're kind of like, hey, we're outlaws right now, but at the same time, we got to step in because, well, Cable just tried to kill off Charles Xavier. And so their goal is to hopefully find their old leader. But now we have to jump over to the hospital, where we actually see the doctors trying their best to save the life of Charles Xavier. Now, you do have some members of the X-Men there as well at the hospital, but also members of X-Factor as well. Now, for some of the members of X-Factor, it makes sense they would be there because some of them were part of the X-Men when Charles Xavier was in charge. And well, Wolfbane, she was part of the New Mutants that was again being watched by Charles Xavier. So some of these characters do have connections to him. But also, let's not forget that Charles Xavier has been trying to work with the government to hopefully build relations between humans and mutants. And so with that, you have the government wondering if Charles is actually going to survive. But also Val Cooper is getting involved. Now, let's not forget that Val Cooper is the liaison for X-Factor, meaning that she has to watch over them to make sure they stay in line because, again, they are a government mutant team. But either way, you have all characters realizing that all they can do is just wait and see if the doctors are able to save his life. Now, when it came to Peter David, when he was working on X-Factor, he wanted to make sure that his plot lines continue on, even though we're now talking about the X-Cutioner Song crossover. And what I truly mean is that in his storyline so far for X-Factor, he had introduced a new group of mutants better known as the X-Patriots. Now, the X-Patriots were a group of mutants who left Genosha when Genosha was not really a safe place for mutants. But they have no idea that Genosha is now actually a safe place for mutants. And so you had X-Factor say, hey, you know what? We're going to take you back to Genosha and show you it is actually a better place now for mutants. But before they were able to do that, you had X-Factor take the X-Patriots out of New York to show them what America is like. But one of their own got seriously injured because he was a mutant trying to create statues in the middle of the park. But the humans in the park thought that he was trying to burn down the actual area. And so they have brutally beating him down to the point where he barely survived the beating. And so we see him currently in the hospital just trying to recover. Now, something else Peter David is trying to tell us is about Wolfbane, because when it came to Wolfbane written under Peter David, we had learned that something is wrong with her, something is different about her, where her emotions are all over the place, but also she has some kind of weird attraction towards Havoc. Either way, when it comes to Wolfbane, she hates the idea of just waiting in the hospital, hoping to see if Charles is going to survive. And so for Havoc, he says, listen, you know what? To keep you busy, I need you to go to the concert area and see if you are able to locate Cable's scent. Because if you are able to do that, we can follow that and hopefully find Cable and figure out why in the world he had attacked Charles Xavier for. You also have Havoc tell Strong Guy to go with Wolfbane to the concert area. Now, we have to jump back over to Archangel for a brief moment, because for Archangel, we are beginning to see him kind of slip when it comes to his mental state, because for Archangel, he has gone through a lot in a very short period of time. For example, when it came to his wings, he lost his wings in the middle of the mutant massacre, but then he met Apocalypse, who did promise him to give him his wings back, which Apocalypse did, but they were metal wings. Now, on top of that, when it came to Apocalypse, he also gave Archangel a bloodlust. And so for Archangel, he has been trying his best to kind of control that lust for blood, but also trying to make sure that he's not following down the influence of Apocalypse. And so for Archangel, he also has become a tad bit more aggressive when he's trying to tame his bloodlust. Either way, he's now declaring to go after Cable, but to also go after Apocalypse as well for what he has done to Archangel. But getting back over to Strong Guy and also Wolfbane, they do arrive at Central Park, the area where the concert took place at. Now, when they do arrive, you have Wolfbane trying her best to look for any clues that could help them figure out where Cable had went to. But while doing that, X-Force arrived. Now, when they do arrive, you have Strong Guy and Wolfbane kind of hide, because technically they're outnumbered. And even though our two characters want to use their powers to arrest X-Force, again, they're outnumbered. And so for right now, all they can do is just, well, hide. But then you have Wolfbane see Sam, aka Cannonball. And those two characters, they're very close because they used to be part of the New Mutants when Charles Xavier was in charge of their schooling. Either way, you have Wolfbane run straight over to Cannonball to give him a hug. And there is another reason why, because you see, over in X-Force Comics, there was a moment where you had Toad's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants actually kill off Sam Guthrie, better known as Cannonball. Now, we had learned in that story arc that apparently Sam might be an external. Now, externals are a group of mutants who have the ability of immortality. And so for that reason right there, Cannonball was able to come back to life, but Wolfbane had no idea that he was alive again. Now, when it comes to X-Force, there are two other characters who used to be very close to Wolfbane, like Boom Boom and Richter. And really, her and Richter used to date. Now, while you have Wolfbane trying to see her old friends, you didn't have Strong Guy trying to arrest X-Force. Because again, they're wanted by the law. And this kind of leads into a big battle between X-Force and X-Factor. Because while the battle goes on, you didn't have the rest of the members of X-Factor arrive just in time to help out Strong Guy and Wolfbane to fight against X-Force. Now, the battle does go on for a few pages where you actually do have X-Factor and X-Force go back and forth in their battle. Now, I'm not really going to sit down here and go through every single page of their battle. Just know that by the end of the battle, you have Cannonball realize that it's best for X-Force to go ahead and leave now when they actually have the chance. Because it does seem like X-Force does have the advantage over X-Factor, but X-Force kind of realized that, hey, sooner or later, they're going to adapt to the battle and actually win and then actually arrest us. So let's go ahead and get the heck out of here before they have the ability to actually arrest us. And so, bam, just like that, X-Force leaves. Now, before they do leave, you have Havoc being able to actually damage the ship or the aircraft that X-Force is using. And with that kind of damage, it's going to leave a trail for our heroes to follow to hopefully find X-Force. Because for X-Factor, they believe that with Cable killing off Charles Xavier, X-Force has to be involved because they don't know that Cable had left the team. And so they feel like if they follow X-Force and take down X-Force, then sooner or later they'll find Cable. Now, before you have X-Factor go back to the hospital, they're then confronted by some members of the X-Men like Wolverine, Rogue, Psylocke, and Gambit. And they ask X-Factor to join in on the hunt for X-Force because, again, they want answers. They want to know why in the world Cable had killed off, tried to kill off Charles Xavier. And again, they feel like their best chance to get that answer is to take down X-Force first. But then you have Havoc ask like, hey, where's my brother at? Because with Charles being seriously injured, you would think he would be here. And that is when you have Wolverine inform Havoc like, yeah, we don't know where Cyclops and Jean Grey are at. And that is when we jump over to the actual base of Apocalypse. Now, we do pick up with the Horsemen of Apocalypse, and they believe that they have been actually talking to Apocalypse and working for Apocalypse this entire time. But in reality, they have not. In reality, they have been just looking at a shadow figure that may show different pieces of the actual armor of Apocalypse. But in reality, they have been working for Mr. Sinister. And they have no idea because they left the room, and that is when he walked out of the shadows. But he's very happy that the Horsemen of Apocalypse had brought him Cyclops and Jean Grey. And so now he is able to continue on with his plans. But now we have to jump back over to the hospital, and we do learn from the doctors what is going on with Charles Xavier. So he has been infected with the techno-organic virus. Now, the techno-organic virus has been around for a very long time in Marvel Comics. It has the ability to transform living tissue into a mechanical organism. And so the problem is there's no cure for Charles Xavier. It does actually seem like he is going to die here. And so the book kind of ends on that note. Really, this the first two chapters end on that note because we still got 11 more chapters to cover and future videos down the road. But the X-Cutioner Song event has truly kicked off. Okay, so I had basically made a mistake here, guys. So when it came to our coverage over the X-Men, I had completely forgot to talk about and cover the Cable miniseries that took place right before the X-Cutioner Song event. And so with that being said, I had already recorded the first two chapters of the actual event. And really, I kind of want to go ahead and continue on with our coverage over the X-Cutioner Song. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and completely cover the entire event. And then down the road, we're going to come back and actually cover the Cable miniseries that takes place before the actual event. And so if you're somebody following our playlist, don't worry. I'm going to make sure all the videos are lined up in the correct order so that you'll be able to have the full understanding of what is happening with the X-Men around this era of time, especially if you are a Cable fan. Now, with all that being said, today's video, we're going to cover X-Cutioner Song Chapter 3, 4, and 5. The next three chapters of this huge, big event for the X-Men. Now, when it comes to these three chapters, we are not really going to learn a lot about what's happening with the X-Men. Really, when it comes to these chapters, we're going to see more battles happening between different X teams, but also X characters as well. Like, for example, we're going to see Apocalypse beat down on the X-Men. Y'all heard that right. Apocalypse beating down on the X-Men. But also, we're gonna see Bishop get his butt kicked by Mr. Sinister. Like, I feel bad for the X-Men in these 3 chapters, really. Now, we're also gonna see that there's some bigger moves being made behind the scenes by a certain character. A character that has been hyped up a lot when it came to our coverage over X-Force and X-Factor, and that would be Strife. But either way, let's go ahead and dive into the next 3 chapters of the X-Cutioner Song. And so as we dive into the 3rd chapter of this event, we actually pick up with X-Men issue number 14. Now, the opening pages of this book does a great job in reminding us what is going on right now with this event. The whole idea that Cable had tried to kill off Charles Xavier by giving Charles the techno-organic virus. Now, the techno-organic virus is a big deal in Marvel Comics. And the reason why, because it basically takes living tissue and turns it into a mechanical organism. And so right now, Charles Xavier is actually going through that process at the moment. And so for the X-Men, they are actually freaking out here because they have no idea if they are able to actually save Charles' life. And the thing is, there's no actual cure. And so it's the X-Men trying their best to at least find one, or to at least find a way to slow down the process so they're able to find a cure to get rid of the actual virus. Now, like I said earlier, it was Cable supposedly who had shot Charles Xavier, who had gave Charles the actual virus. And for the X-Men and X-Factor, the last thing they heard about Cable was that he was the leader of X-Force. Now, they have no idea that Cable had left X-Force behind and Cannonball had taken over the role as the leader of the team. Either way, for our 2 teams of heroes, they believe if they go after X-Force, they should be able to find Cable. If they find Cable, then maybe they can find a way to save Charles Xavier. And so now we're seeing the hunt for X-Force truly begin here. But now we have to jump over to Mr. Sinister. Now, in our last video, we had talked about the idea of Sinister pretending to be Apocalypse as a way to trick the 4 horsemen of Apocalypse to help him out, because they believed the entire time that they were working for their master, that they were talking to their master, but in reality, they were talking to Sinister. Either way, he had the 4 horsemen of Apocalypse to go after Cyclops and Jean Grey and actually capture them and bring them back over to him. Now again, they still believed they were talking to Apocalypse, not knowing they were working for Mr. Sinister. Now, after that, we kind of find out in this chapter that he has taken Cyclops and Jean Grey over to the Mutant Liberation Front. Now, this is a group of characters that we had actually talked about before in the past in our previous videos. You see, originally, they were a group of characters that are being led by Strife. Now, at this point in our coverage over the X-Men, we don't know much about Strife. All we know is that he looks like Cable, and he also hates Cable a lot as well. And that's really it. Now, when it came to him and his group, they were only going after different government bases that were kind of being used as a way to attack the mutant race. But now it seems like they got bigger plans, especially with Cyclops and Jean Grey. And so once you have Sinister being able to make the trade, they give him the genetic matrix. Now, we have no idea what that is just yet, but of course, down the road, we might learn more about it. But now we have to jump over to X-Force. Now, when it comes to X-Force, in our last video, they had just, well, really barely survived a battle against X-Factor. Because remember, right now, X-Factor and X-Men, they believe that with Cable trying to kill off Charles Xavier, and of course, the last time they heard anything about Cable, he was the leader of X-Force, they believe that X-Force may be involved with what Cable is trying to do. but also they're trying to find X-Force to hopefully find Cable. Now, for X-Force, they were able to barely get away from X-Factor when it came to their battle. The problem is having made sure to do some damage to their aircraft. And the reason why, because it is going to leave a trail for the X-Men and X-Factor to follow to hopefully find X-Force. Now, when it comes to X-Force, they're trying to survive right now because their aircraft can no longer stay in the air. And so they have to use their powers as a way to basically survive the crash. And when they do, they're kind of wondering what to do next because they now know that sooner or later, X-Factor and the X-Men are going to be able to find them. And when they do, can X-Force actually survive a battle against both teams at the same time? But now we have to jump over to Egypt. And the reason why, because we pick up with the Dark Riders. Now, the Dark Riders are another group of characters who actually work for Apocalypse alongside with the Four Horsemen of Apocalypse. Now, when it comes to the Dark Riders, they are actually went to Egypt to wake up their master, and their master being Apocalypse. Now, like I said in our last video, when it came to Apocalypse, the last time we saw him was when X-Factor, the original X-Factor, fought against them alongside the Inhumans, and we were kind of left to believe in the possibility that he may be gone. But here he is right now, waking up after being in a chamber, slowly healing up after his last battle. And right now, he's very angry about being let out before he had been completely properly healed. But you have the Dark Rider say, hey man, listen, somebody is using your horsemen without your permission. Somebody is making moves against different members of the X-Men in your name, and we have no idea who it could possibly be. And so now Apocalypse has to get involved in this event. But now we must jump over to the X-Men and also X-Factor as they make their way over to the location of where X-Force is possibly at. Now, in these 3 pages, it's really more of these 2 teams trying to get a better understanding of X-Force. And let me explain. You see, in the early 1990s, all the different X-Men teams were kind of different from one another. Like the 2 X-Men teams, Blue and Gold team, they were the same. They were trying to carry on Charles Xavier's dream. But when it came to X-Factor, they were more like the government team, trying to build relations between the government and also the mutant race. But when it came to X-Force, they were that military team, that Black Ops team, that was not really afraid to cross the lines if they had to. If they had to kill somebody, they were okay with the idea of killing that person. Like, for example, Mask, who was the leader of the Morlocks in the early 1990s. Either way, for our 2 teams here, they're trying to understand how can a group of characters like X-Force follow a man like Cable. But for Wolverine, it makes a lot of sense because those members of X-Force are basically soldiers. Cable is their general. It's Wolverine saying, when times get hard for you, you begin to change into somebody you never thought you would become. But also, as time gets hard for you, you have a better understanding of how the world truly is. Either way, once you have our 2 teams realize they can find X-Force, they head straight over to that location. Now, I want to jump over to Cable because Cable has actually been gone the entire time this event has kicked off, which means that the Cable we saw earlier was not actually Cable. And that is why I said when it came to the Cable miniseries, we should have covered that series before the actual events of the X-Cutioner Song. But don't worry, down the road, we're going to cover that actual story. Either way, with Cable being able to come back to this time, he gets to update what happened while he was gone. And he comes to find out that Charles Xavier had basically been shot at, has been given the techno-organic virus. Now for Cable, he's all like, that should have never happened. Who in the world has shot Xavier? And that is when Cable finds out, well, it was himself. Or we seem to be somebody else pretending to be him. Either way, Cable realized he has some work to do. Now, I want to jump back over to the X Mansion where we do pick up with Bishop and Jubilee being on guard. Now, for those two characters, they're the only two X-Men characters right now at the X Mansion. Both of the X-Men teams right now are on different missions. You see, the blue team, which is usually Cyclops' team, they're on a mission with X Factor right now to find X-Force. While you have the gold team right now on a mission to find out what happened to Cyclops and Jean Grey and why did Apocalypse possibly kidnap them. And so for Bishop, he had decided to stay behind as a way to protect Charles Xavier. And Jubilee, well, she also stayed behind as well. Either way, with those two characters, they're on guard right now of the entire mansion, except somebody was able to sneak their way into the actual place. And so for Bishop, once the alarms goes off, he runs back inside, and we come to find out it was Mr. Sinister. But now he has two hostages between him and Bishop. That will be Stevie Hunter and Val Cooper. Now, for Mr. Sinister, he says he came here to make sure that Charles Xavier pays for his sins. In the ending of this chapter, we jump back over to the X-Men and also X-Factor as they arrive at the location of where X-Force has been hiding at. And so for these two teams, at first, they're kind of wondering, where is X-Force hiding at? But then by the end of this chapter, you have X-Force pop out and they kind of realize they have no choice here. If they want to get away from the X-Men and X-Factor, they're gonna have to fight against them right here, right now, in the middle of the jungle or desert. And so this leads into the next chapter where we're going to see X-Force trying their best to handle two different X teams coming at them at once. Now, part 4 takes place in X-Force issue number 16. Now, with that being said, we do pick up with X-Force about to battle against both the X-Men, the blue team, and also X-Factor. Now, for X-Force, they're trying their best to talk to the other two teams like, hey, listen, we're not really with Cable. Matter of fact, we were trying to find Cable as a way to bring him in. Now, technically, you don't have X-Force saying that to X-Factor and the X-Men team, but they really want to sit down and talk things out and explain things to the other two teams. But unfortunately, it kind of seems like no one is really able to slow things down and just talk it out. And so, of course, we do get a battle between all three X teams. Now, unfortunately, it's not fair for X-Force because you have two different teams coming at you at once from both ends. And so, after a few pages, after you have X-Force trying their best to survive this battle, you have Cannonball say, hey, X-Force, we gotta retreat. Let's go ahead and hide in the jungles as a way to get away from them, because right now, if we stay here, we are going to lose this battle. Now, getting over to the other X team, they had decided to, look into what exactly happened to Cyclops and Jean Grey. And so their main goal is to find the 4 horsemen of Apocalypse. Really just 3 at this point in time. But either way, you do have our heroes decide to go look for the horsemen of Apocalypse. And when they do, they get into a battle at this warehouse where they found the horsemen hiding at. Now, we do get a few pages of our heroes actually battling against the horsemen of Apocalypse. But by the end of the battle, you have our heroes being able to easily win that battle, also with the help of Quicksilver as well. Now remember, Quicksilver was a mutant around his time in Marvel Comics, but also he was part of the X-Factor team, but he came with the X-Men to help out to hopefully find Apocalypse and to bring down Apocalypse, but to also find Jean Grey and Cyclops. Now, once you have our heroes being able to defeat the Horsemen, you didn't have the X-Men find something left behind by somebody else. And we kind of find out it was a message left behind by Mr. Sinister, because he knew that sooner or later the X-Men would come after the Horsemen to find Cyclops and Jean Grey. He also knew that the Horsemen would lose to the X-Men. Either way, he tells the X-Men like, hey, listen, so it was me who had actually sent the Horsemen after Cyclops and Jean Grey. But I'm telling you right now, I no longer have them. Also, my part in this crazy game is officially over. But I am going to tell you one last thing, though. You see, this whole entire game is being done because of Apocalypse, because he's the reason why you have somebody very ticked off playing this game against all the different moving pieces. And then you have Sinister basically in the message. And so for our heroes, they're kind of wondering, who is he talking about? If Apocalypse is not the one in charge of this game, then who is actually in charge of this game? And really, when we jump back over to the X Mansion, we finally pick back up with Bishop getting ready to shoot Sinister to hopefully save the life of Stevie Hunter and also Val Cooper. Now, for Sinister, he believes that Bishop will not actually pull the trigger. Yo, this homeboy was completely wrong, because you have Bishop go ahead and pull that trigger so fast, he leaves a hole in Sinister's head. Now, you would think like, okay, he's dead. But you didn't have Sinister get right back up and say, nah, I cannot die that easily. But also, I want to tell you that I'm only here to hopefully lead you guys in the right direction to figure out who is actually behind this whole entire crazy scheme. And so after he leaves a paper behind for Val Cooper to read. And so now she knows who may be behind all of this mess. But now we have to jump over to Cable. Now, really, this one page is just Cable getting ready to get involved because he actually knows who's behind all of this. But for Cable, he wants to make sure that he is properly prepared to deal with the person behind all of this mess at the moment. But now we have to jump over to Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now remember, Sinister had handed over Cyclops and Jean Grey over to the Mutant Liberation Front, really their leader, and that would be Strife. Now for Strife, this is the moment where he begins to call himself the actual crown prince of the mutant race. But then he calls Cyclops and Jean Grey his father and mother. And it's kind of like, wait a second, what does that actually mean? And so to wrap up this chapter, we jump back over to X-Force. Now, X-Force, they're trying their best to get away from X-Factor and the Blue Team X-Men. But the problem is, well, the Blue Team and X-Factor, they're not trying to give up. And they have sent Wolverine to hopefully find X-Force in the jungle. Now, for Wolverine, it's kind of like having a wild animal on your team. And so for Wolverine, he was able to easily track down X-Force. And then one by one, you have each member of the X-Force being taken out by different members of the X-Men and also X-Factor. And so with that happening, well, by the end of this chapter, X-Force has now been officially captured by X-Factor and the X-Men. And now they are going to be taken back to the X-Mansion, so you have our two teams begin to interrogate X-Force to hopefully find the information that they are looking for. The problem is they might not get that information that they're actually looking for. But now we have to jump into Uncanny X-Men issue number 295, where we actually pick up with Apocalypse. Now, for Apocalypse, this is a man who's trying to figure out what the heck is going on here when it comes to his horsemen, because he got word from his Dark Riders that the horsemen of Apocalypse have been going on the world fighting against the X-Men in his name. And for Apocalypse, he has no idea why, because he has not told his horsemen to do anything at all. And so he wants to know what in the world is actually going on. Now, this is an Apocalypse who's not fully healed up yet, because this man has gone through his healing chamber, but not all the way yet. And so he was released early by the Dark Riders, who told him like, hey boss, your horsemen are going crazy out there without your actual guidance, and we have no idea why. And so he had to leave his healing chamber early to figure out what's happening with the horsemen of Apocalypse. Now, when he does arrive at one of his safe houses, he's then confronted by the X-Men, who were able to realize that this was one of his safe houses and they were now looking for him. Now, I want to jump back over to the X Mansion. Here's the reason why. Because X Force is now prisoners for X Factor and also the X Men. But also, I kind of want to say that for X Force, they are a young group of kids who were unfortunately turned into soldiers for some kind of war that Cable had against unknown enemies across the world. And so for Polaris, she hates the idea that these young kids are being locked up as prisoners. And so for Havoc, he says, you have to understand that technically right now, they are best chance to finding Cable. But also for Havoc, it's kind of like those kids chose a path. They chose the path to become soldiers. They're no longer really trying to follow Charles Xavier's dream. But either way, X-Force is now prisoners of X Factor and the X-Men. Now we actually jump back over to Psylocke, and you really have Psylocke standing by Charles Xavier, and she sees a techno-organic virus slowly killing him off. Now for Psylocke, she kind of feels like the best way to actually help out Charles Xavier is to help him move on. But at the same time, she wants to make sure that it's something that he wants to do. Either way, she is called away for a big meeting. But now we're kind of left with the idea that Psylocke might actually do it. Now, we actually do get a small preview of the battle between the X-Men and also Apocalypse, because like I said earlier, Apocalypse is going to give the X-Men one heck of a beatdown. And so you do have the Gold Team trying their best to battle against Apocalypse. And at first, it may seem like because he's in a weaker state, they might actually win. Guys, let me tell you right now, that was one heck of a mistake for the X-Men to think they'll be able to actually take on Apocalypse. But now we have to jump back over to Jean Grey. Now remember, Jean Grey is currently a prisoner for, well, Strife. And we have no idea why yet. Now earlier, we saw him call Jean Grey and Cyclops mother and father. And him call himself the prince of the mutant race. And so we're kind of left to believe in some kind of way that he is actually the child of Cyclops and Jean Grey. But the question is, how? How in the world is that possible? But either way, Jean Grey is still being tortured by this man. And she wants to know why in the world he's doing all this for. But getting back over to the X-Men and also X-Factor, they are now informed by Val Cooper that she had received information about who is actually the man behind everything happening at the moment. And of course, that would be Strife. Now, for all of our heroes, they don't know much about this character. At the same time, they still feel like it's actually Cable who has been pretending to be Strife the entire time. Really, when it comes to our two teams here, they have so many different theories of what's really going on when it comes to Cable, but also Strife as well. Either way, it's now our heroes kind of realizing that maybe Strife is the one pulling all the strings. But the question is right now, is Cable actually Strife? Or is there a possibility it's two different people right now? Now for Val Cooper, she wants to know where in the world is Wolverine and Bishop at? And we kind of find out that Bishop and also Wolverine had went over to Department K. Now, Department K is really more like the special government branch for Canada. And the problem is, well, Department K was not really able to share resources to Val Cooper and X-Factor when it came to hunting down, well, Cable. And so for Wolverine and Bishop, they kind of feel like Department K is hiding something. So you had these two characters just working together, taking out different members of Department K. And it's also kind of building up that friendship between these two characters. Because you have Bishop say, hey, Wolverine, listen, I love the idea of being here with you, but please make sure you don't tell Storm what I am actually doing here. Like, you know, possibly killing some people. And for Logan, he's all like, hey, you know what? I won't tell a soul at all. Now I want to jump back over to Apocalypse because you have Apocalypse delivering that beatdown over to the X-Men because you have the X-Men believing that they might have a chance in actually beating down on Apocalypse. Like I said earlier, this is Apocalypse in a weaker state. Like they should be able to win, you would think. But no, y'all, this is Apocalypse. This man ain't playing around. This man said y'all have truly messed up. And so you have Apocalypse beat down on all the X-Men Gold team right there in his safe house. Now, for Apocalypse, he realized that what the X-Men were saying could possibly be true. There's somebody else out there pulling all the strings. But the question is right now, who? And so you have Apocalypse realize that he has to reserve his powers until he's able to find out who is the real person behind all of this mess. But now we have to jump back over to Gambit and also Havoc. Now you have these two characters meeting up with, well, Cannonball. Now, when it comes to this meeting, it's really more of Gambit and Havoc wanting to know what Cannonball knows about the Mutant Liberation Front, the group being led by Strife. Now, for Cannonball, he does not know much about the actual group. Really, for him, he knows about the same amount of information as the other two groups know. He might know a tad bit more, but that's really it. But for Cannonball, it's kind of like, listen, if you're trying to figure out which safe house they're staying at, I might have an idea. But before I am able to share that kind of information over to you, I need you guys to know that I want a deal being made. Basically saying like, hey, I want to see X-Force be released without any kind of charges at all. Now, for X Factor and the X-Men, they're kind of like, that's not going to happen. But guess what? If you help us, we'll allow X-Force to help us out to bring down Strife. Now, for Cannonball, he does agree. But the problem is, though, he's kind of like, listen, I don't know the exact location of which base he could possibly be at, but I might have an idea, maybe. Now, the ending for today's video is going to be one heck of a cliffhanger because you actually do have a story jump back over to Wolverine and also Bishop, who are currently still at Department K. But while being there, well, somebody else arrives. And that would be good old Cable. And Cable's all like, great, I found these two guys. And these two guys are about to fight against Cable. And so this is okay, so it's time for us to continue our coverage over the X-Cutioner Song. Now, technically, we already covered the first 5 chapters of this crossover. So today's video is going to be another 3 more chapters we're going to cover. So part 6, part 7, and also part 8. Now, part 6 does take place in X Factor issue number 85. And really, the opening pages of this chapter does remind us where we left off at when it comes to our last video. Now remember, at the end of our last video, you had Wolverine and Bishop attacking Department K. Now Department K is the government branch or the secret government branch for Canada. When it came to Wolverine and also Bishop, they realized that Department K is not really trying to help out the X-Teens find Cable. Because remember, right now, most of the X characters believe that Cable was the one who has shot Charles Xavier with the techno-organic virus. Now, in reality, it wasn't Cable. But the problem is, Cable has to prove that he's actually innocent. And so for Cable, he went over to Department K as well. The problem is, Bishop and Wolverine were already there. And so when they see him, they're like, hey, wait a second. We have been trying our best to find you because we still believe that you were the one who has shot Charles Xavier. And so we do see both sides begin to battle against one another. But now we have to jump over to X Factor, X-Men, and also X-Force. Now remember, these 3 teams are now working together to hopefully find Strife. Because recently, thanks to Mr. Sinister, they were given intel that kind of said like, listen, the real person behind everything going on in this crossover is not Apocalypse, it's not me, Sinister, and it's also not Cable, it is Strife. Now, when it comes to our heroes, they don't know much about the character. All they do know is that he is the leader for the Mutant Liberation Front, and that is really it. Now for X-Force, they know most of the bases they actually use across the world. And so for X Factor and the X-Men, they're kind of like, listen, X-Force, if you are actually able to figure out which base they are staying at, talking about Strife and the Mutant Liberation Front, it'll be really grateful, but also we could possibly save the life of Charles Xavier. And so thanks to X-Force, they were able to find the main base for Strife group. But the question is right now, is Strife there when you have the X-Men, X-Factor, and X-Force attacking the place at the moment? But now we have to jump over to Apocalypse. Now, this is Apocalypse trying his best to do some detective work because in the earlier chapters, he found out that somebody was using his name as a way to trick his horsemen to do their dirty work. And of course, it was Mr. Sinister. But really, for Sinister, he told the horsemen to only kidnap Cyclops and Jean Grey, and then he had handed them over to Strife. But either way, for Apocalypse, he's trying to figure out who is actually behind everything. Now, he found one of the bases that belongs to Cable, but he also realized the tech that Cable used is very advanced, very similar to the same kind of tech that Apocalypse has been using for a while now as well. And so for Apocalypse, he's kind of wondering, if this is Cable's base, but its technology is just as advanced as mine, that means one of the members of X Factor might be secretly Cable and we had no idea. Now for him, he's not really talking about the new X Factor team. He is talking about the original X Factor team. Cyclops, Jean Grey, Iceman, Archangel, and also Beast. Now, really, most of this chapter is just more fighting. So, for example, we jump back over to Bishop and also Wolverine trying their best to fight against Cable. Now, really, for me, this is kind of impressive for Cable because he's actually able to hold his own against both Bishop and Wolverine. Now, really, when I say hold his own, it does last for like a few more panels. By the time you get to page 3 of this section, you have Bishop ready to go toe-to-toe with Cable. And so it kind of left to wonder who would actually win, Cable and Bishop, because these two characters, they both come from different timelines, different futures. Either way, their battle continues on. But getting back into some more action, we jump back over to X Factor, X-Men, and also X-Force as they continue to battle against the Mutant Liberation Front. Now, when they do attack this base and they do find different members of the actual group, for our heroes, they realize they have now found the main base of the Mutant Liberation Front. But either way, now their battle continues on as well. But now we have to jump over to Cyclops and Jean Grey. And here's the reason why. Because in the first chapter of this event, we saw the 4 horsemen of Apocalypse kidnap Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, like I said earlier, the only reason why the horsemen did that because they believed that Sinister was actually Apocalypse. Either way, they were completely wrong. But now for Cyclops and Jean Grey, they are current prisoners of Strife. Now, in an earlier chapter, we had Strife call Cyclops and Jean Grey the king and queen of the mutant race. And he called himself the prince of the mutant race. So it kind of left to believe that maybe Strife could be the actual son of Cyclops and Jean Grey. Either way, they're currently his prisoners, and we have no exact idea what he has planned for them down the road. But now we have to jump over to Archangel. Now for Archangel, in recent story arcs, we have begun to see him become more aggressive. And let me explain why. So for Archangel, as we all know, he was just your regular angel at first. But back in the Mutant Massacre, he had lost his wings. Now, thanks to Apocalypse, he was able to gain new wings. The problem was that you had Angel turn into, well, Archangel, an evil version of himself. Now, he was able to turn back in the good side of him again, but you didn't have Archangel kind of claim that he has this bloodlust inside of him, the bloodlust that came from Apocalypse. Now, he does kind of speak in a way that he was able to control that bloodlust, but also for Apocalypse here, he's now a main target for Archangel because Archangel had become very devoted to make sure that he gets payback for what Apocalypse had done to him. Now we do see Archangel fighting against some members of the Mutant Liberation Front, but one of them tried their best to come from behind to get the jump on Archangel. But while he was turning, his wings also turned with him, cutting off the head of that member of the actual group. Now for Archangel, he's trying to say like, hey, it was a complete accident. Like, really, I was turning, my wings turned, and it cut his head off on accident. But at the same time, can we truly believe that? But now we have to jump back over to Bishop and Wolverine fighting against Cable. Now, really, for this battle, it does get wrapped up because you have Cable continue to try to preach that he is actually innocent, that he was not involved in the idea of shooting Charles Xavier. Now, for Wolverine, he actually does stop attacking Cable, and he does stop Bishop as well. And the reason why, because he's all like, listen, if I go after Cable, he'll be dead. And unfortunately, we need him alive. But at the same time, if he's saying that he's actually innocent, then yes, we double have to make sure that he does stay alive to figure out who was actually behind the actual shooting of Charles Xavier. And so you have Wolverine and Bishop begin to talk to Cable to hopefully figure out who is actually responsible. Now, the ending of this chapter is not really anything special. And what I mean is that we do jump back over to X-Factor, X-Force, and also the X-Men fighting against the Mutant Liberation Front. Now, as their battle continues on, you actually have most of our heroes being able to take out most of the members of the Mutant Liberation Front. The problem is that you have Quicksilver getting a tad bit cocky. And so once he was able to save Gambit, he was not watching his back. And so now you have Reaper, one of the members of the Mutant Liberation Front, about to get the chance to, well, kill off Quicksilver. And so the chapter ends on that note and leading us into part 7. Now, part 7 does take place in X-Men issue number 15, and we actually just continue the battle going on between the X-Men, X-Factor, X-Force, and also the Mutant Liberation Front. And so, as the battle continues on, we do get a lot of cool action scenes. Unfortunately for me, they're not really important when it comes to the overall story. So, really, it's just cool things to see, like, Psylocke helping out here, Storm being cool Omega level mutant, Rogue going one-on-one against somebody. Like, we do get a lot of good fight scenes, but we now jump into the part of the fight where you have Boom Boom and Cannonball actually confront two other old team members, and that will be Fire Fist and also Skid. You see, back in the original X-Factor team days, like Cyclops, Iceman, Beast, Archangel, and also Jean Grey, they were trying their best to carry on Charles Xavier's dream. And so what they did was they went around the world and began to help out different mutants in need. And one of their first ones was actually a character known as Fire Fist. Now, Fire Fist stayed with X-Factor for a good while. And matter of fact, so did Skid, who was actually part of the Morlocks, but then joined over X-Factor alongside with Fire Fist. They were both the kind of like the trainees for X-Factor. But then after a while, you had both team members actually join the New Mutants for a very short period of time because they were just young enough to be part of that group. But then right after they had joined the New Mutants, they were kind of forced to join the Mutant Liberation Front, but it now seems like they have been completely brainwashed to the point where they actually believe what Strife is doing is the correct thing for the mutant race. Either way, you do have Boom Boom and also Cannonball take out their old team members. But to kind of wrap everything up when it comes to our heroes fighting against the Mutant Liberation Front, you then have Thor tell Havoc that with every single member of their group now defeated, it's now time for them to begin their interrogation on every single member of this group to hopefully find Strife. Because right now, that is their main goal. And they're hoping that by finding him and beating him, they can still save Charles Xavier's life. But now we can finally jump back over to Bishop, Wolverine, and also Cable. Now remember, Wolverine is starting to try to figure out if Cable is telling the truth. And so you have all three characters trying their best to leave Department K. And the reason why I say trying their best because, well, they're being chased down by Department K for, well, breaking into their actual facility. But you have Cable being able to teleport our heroes out of there. And this kind of begins the whole idea for Wolverine and I say other X members kind of realizing that Cable has some advanced tech because the ability to just teleport out of there just like that is really impressive to Wolverine and also Bishop. Now, for Colossus, we do get a page where we are reminded that he had just lost his brother, Michael. And remember, Michael just came back right after you had the birth of both the gold team and blue team for X-Men comics. And so for Colossus, he was kind of happy about the idea of finally having his brother back after believing for so many years that his brother was dead, to only now having his brother dead once again, but this time for real. And so for Colossus, he's kind of wondering, how can he tell his sister, who she never met, that her long lost brother who came back to life is dead again? And how can he tell his own parents that? And so for Colossus, he's kind of sad at the moment. And you have Strong Guy trying his best to make Colossus feel better, but it's not an easy thing to get over. But now we have to jump over to Beast and also Morbid Taggart. Now you have these two characters just trying their best to hopefully find a way to save the life of Charles Xavier, who is still being affected by the techno-organic virus. Now for Beast, he's not really ready to give up just yet. But Morbid Taggart, she's kind of like, look, Beast, we have tried so many things, and unfortunately, we're not getting anywhere at all. Like, it's probably best for us to go ahead and let Charles die. And really for her, she kind of feels like Charles was dead at the moment he was shot by what they believe to be as Cable. Now, we jump back over to Strife, and really for Strife, we kind of get reminded of the whole idea that there's some big connection going on between him, Cyclops, and also Jean Grey. Now, the way the story is kind of going, you would automatically believe that he is actually the son of Cyclops and Jean Grey. And let me explain why, because currently they're still his hostages at the moment, but he does go to check in on them, and he begins to feed them like a baby needs to be fed. And so you're kind of left to wonder that with him saying earlier on that Cyclops and Jean Grey are the king and queen of the mutant race, and he is the prince of the mutant race, it's kind of like all of these hints are pointing at the fact that maybe Strife is the long lost son of Cyclops and Jean Grey. Technically, the long lost son of Cyclops and Madeline Pryor. Because remember, baby Nathan was taken into the future as a way to save his life. And so we're kind of left to believe that maybe this is baby Nathan coming back from the actual future. Now, the ending of this chapter is really more of the book kind of saying like, okay, we're going to get the battle between Apocalypse and also Strife, because you do have Strife go over to Egypt, where of course is the home base for Apocalypse. Now, the Dark Riders, they are there to protect Apocalypse while he's still in his healing process. But the problem is the Dark Riders, they don't stand a chance against Strife at all. And so he was able to defeat them so easily that like in 2 pages, the battle is completely over. And so then you have Strife walk over to the healing chamber of Apocalypse. He's all like, nah, bro, it's time for us to battle. It's time for us to have that big battle once and for all. And for Apocalypse, he knows that unfortunately, he has no choice here. If he wants to survive, he has to battle against Strife, even though technically at the moment, Strife has the upper hand. And so now we are able to jump into part 8. Now, when we do see that Strife is able to beat down on Apocalypse. Now, I really want to focus more on what is being said in this actual battle, because you have Strife being able to beat down on Apocalypse, but it's really more a Strife saying like, hey, Apocalypse, this is payback for everything you have done to me, because technically you destroyed my entire life. Now, for Apocalypse, he has no idea who Strife truly is. He says, listen, I don't know who you are. I have no idea why you are after me at all. But for Strife, he's really doubling down on the whole concept that Apocalypse had done something to him in the past to ruin his entire life. And so for me personally, it was kind of like Marvel saying like, hey, we're throwing hints out left and right for you guys to kind of say that this could be possibly baby Christopher or baby Nathan coming back from the future, being very upset for what Apocalypse did to him when he was a baby. Now, for Apocalypse, he is stabbed by some blade that only one person has been stabbed with in Apocalypse past. somebody that he had supposedly killed. Either way, you do have Apocalypse being able to get the heck out of there. And for Strife, it really does bother him a lot. But also for Strife, the great thing is that for the Dark Riders, they watched the battle. They watched their master Apocalypse lose to Strife. And so now they want to begin to work for Strife. And so now his army has grown once again. But now we have to jump over to Cable, who's now talking to Bishop and Wolverine. Now, for me personally, it's kind of like Cable giving out more information about Strife over to Bishop and Wolverine, but also us as the readers. Because for Strife, by this point in Marvel Comics, we didn't know much about the character. All we kind of knew was that, well, he is possibly from the future because he had the same face as Cable. Now, for Cable, he tells us that for Strife, the reason why he came back to the past is because, well, he wanted to make sure the rise of the High Lords did not happen. Now, remember, the High Lords are, well, a group of mutants known as the X-Ternals. Now remember, the X-Ternals are a group of mutants that have the ability of immortality. And so for Cable, he came back in time as well to make sure the newest High Lord would awaken, and that was Cannonball. Because remember, back in X-Force Comics, Cannonball died, but then right after that, he came back to life, kind of showing that maybe he is the next High Lord. But apparently for Cable, he said, listen, he wanted to make sure the next High Lord did not awaken, to kind of control the idea of the High Lords not being able to rise up in the far future. But also for Cable, he wants to know why in the world Strife has his face, because Cable believes that he is the original and maybe Strife could possibly be a clone. Now, I kind of want to jump back over to the X-Mansion because I want to establish that earlier, even though we saw X-Men, X-Factor, and X-Force working together to fight against the Mutant Liberation Front, that is not technically true. See, let me explain. You see, when it came to X-Force, only 2 of their team members were actually there. That would be Cannonball and also Boom Boom. The rest of the team, they were still locked up. And so for Havoc, he's kind of like, hey, listen, I need you to go down there and kind of talk to your team because it does seem like they're very upset. And in reality, it kind of seems like they have the right to be upset because they're still locked up, and their team leader and one of his closest friends were able to leave and go on a mission while the rest of the team is still locked up. And so we can kind of tell that this might be an issue after the X-Cutioner Song crossover. Now, something else I do want to talk about is Jamie Madrox. Let me explain. So he has the ability to create clones of himself. Now, here's the big problem though. You see, one of his clones kind of got tricked by Mr. Sinister, and that clone kind of lived his own entire life for a brief moment, where he had actually built a relationship with Siren, the daughter of Banshee. And the reason why that is a huge problem, because she believed it was the original Jamie, but in reality, it wasn't. And so for her, she's kind of like, we had an entire relationship together, and now here you are acting like we had nothing at all between each other. And for him, he did not, because it wasn't him. It was his clone. Now, the ending of this book is amazing, but before we actually dive into the ending of this chapter and where we're going to end today's video, we jump back over to Cyclops and Jean Grey, kind of reestablishing the whole idea that, hey, they're still being the hostages for Strife. But once you have Strife kind of move on to a different task after checking in on them, you have Jean Grey and Cyclops begin the process of trying to escape from Strife's base. And the question is right now, will they actually be, able to leave the base, or will they get caught again by Strife down the road in following chapters? Now, let's get into the big ending for this video, the big ending for this chapter alone. Because we jump back over to the X Mansion. And when we do, we actually pick up with the X-Men, just hanging out, chilling, minding their business. But then out of nowhere, somebody teleports into their actual home. Now, here's the big catch, because earlier we saw Apocalypse teleport away after losing to Strife and kind of left to wonder where in the world did he end up at after teleporting away. Well, we kind of find out that this man had teleported over to the X Mansion. He says, listen, so we have to fight against Strife, but together. And so now this is going to be Apocalypse teaming up with the X-Men, X Factor, X Force to fight against Strife. And the question is, can they actually win against him? Because it could seem like this is also part of his plan, kind of knowing that sooner or later, both parties might come together to fight against him in one heck of a final battle. But okay, so it's time for us to jump back into some more X-Cutioner Song. Now, with that being said, we're going to cover another 3 more chapters. So, part 9, part 10, and also part 11. Now, with these 3 chapters, I do want to say real quickly, the reason why we're not covering part 12 as well, along with these 3 chapters, because there is actually an epilogue that comes out right after part 12. And I want to kind of use that epilogue as a way to say, hey, we are going to begin our next coverage over X-Men comics leading into the next crossover, which should be Fatal Attractions. So, with that being said, the next video will actually be our last one. But today we're going to cover part 9, 10, and 11. And so with that, when it comes to part 9, it actually does take place in the Uncanny X-Men issue number 296. Now, the opening pages of this book does remind us of a few things going on in this crossover. So, for example, Cyclops and Jean Grey, because remember, they were kidnapped by Strife at the very beginning of this crossover. Technically, they were kidnapped by Mr. Sinister, and then he had handed them over to Strife. But again, that all took place at the very beginning of the actual crossover. But we do see our 2 heroes trying to escape from the actual base of Strife. Now, while doing that, they are confronted by the Dark Riders. Now, the Dark Riders are not like Apocalypse Horsemen. They're kind of like a lower ranking group that Apocalypse used for different kinds of reasons. Now, when it came to Strife, when he had battle against Apocalypse, he was able to beat down on Apocalypse. So for the Dark Riders, they're kind of like, hey, you know what? You had defeated our master. And it kind of showed that he was not strong enough to actually lead us. And so now you have the Dark Riders following Strife. And currently, they're trying to fight against Cyclops and Jean Grey, who are trying to escape. Now, for our heroes, they are able to easily take down some members of the Dark Riders. Now, while they are trying to escape, they have no idea that technically they are being watched by Strife. Now, this is Strife saying, like, listen, I let them escape because this is also part of my plan as well. Now, when it comes to this actual crossover, we're still kind of learning more and more things about the character of Strife. And really, we're not going to know everything until the very end of the actual crossover. Now, we have to jump over to Beast in the medical lab, who's trying his best to, save the life of Charles Xavier, who was infected by the techno-organic virus. Now, for Beast, this man has been trying so many different things that he thought could possibly help Charles fight against the virus. The problem is, nothing is working. And so for Beast, it does seem like he may have found something else that could possibly work. But then in the middle of him trying to figure out if it could work, he is then messaged by Moira McTaggart, who then tells him that she has a message that was left behind by Strife. And of course, it's Strife saying, I am smarter than you, kind of playing mind games with our heroes. Now we have to jump over to Cable, Bishop, and also Wolverine. Now remember, those characters are technically their own group right now, and they're also trying their best to figure out how can they locate the actual base of Strife. Now technically, these pages are being used as a way to remind us a few things about Strife, and really, it's not a lot to go by because all we know is that for some reason Strife had went out of his way to kidnap Cyclops and Jean Grey, apparently the heart of the X-Men, but also Strife has the same face as Cable. What is the big connection between Strife, Cable, Cyclops, and Jean Grey? Because the Bishop, if they are able to figure out what that connection is, then most likely they have the key they need to defeat Strife and end this madness once and for all. Now, I want to jump back over to Cyclops and Jean Grey. Here's the reason why. Because you have Strife leaving out so many clues that kind of say like, hey, there is some big connection between you guys and me. And really, it's Strife saying like, hey, I could possibly be your son that you had given up in the past when it came to Apocalypse, who had also gave me the techno-organic virus. And you had no choice but to go ahead and send me into the future to hopefully save my life. And the reason why I'm saying that because you have Cyclops and Jean Grey just running around the base of Strife, and they run into a baby that was left behind. And really, for Cyclops, he's kind of like, why in the world is there a baby here? That is kind of weird. But now we have to jump over to Apocalypse. Now remember, Apocalypse, when it came to our last video, this man fought against Strife. And this man lost to Strife really badly. Because remember, ever since the huge X Factor Endgame story arc, Apocalypse has been healing up. The problem is, every single time he tries to go through the actual healing process, something stops him from actually healing up. And so when it came to his battle against Strife, he was not completely healed up yet. And so you actually have Strife being able to beat down on Apocalypse. Now for Apocalypse, he was able to escape. And he went over to the X Mansion to basically say, hey, X-Men, if you guys want to be able to take down Strife, you have to work with me. It's the only way to actually defeat him. Now, for the X-Men, they're kind of like, why should we help you out? And it's Apocalypse saying, because I can save the life of Charles Xavier. And so at first, you have our hero say, no, we can't trust you. But for Archangel, he's kind of like, no, we can trust Apocalypse when it comes to hopefully saving the life of Charles Xavier. And the reason why, because Archangel has seen firsthand what Apocalypse can do with that kind of technology, meaning that Apocalypse is their only hope to save the life of Charles Xavier. Now, once we jump back over to Wolverine, Bishop, and also Cable, you have our three characters realize like, hey, what if Strife is hiding in plain sight? Like he knew that we would not look in a certain area when it comes to try to figure out where he's working out of. And so you have our heroes sit down and realize that for Strife, he will be working out of a base that was possibly owned in the past by Apocalypse, that has not been used by Apocalypse in a good while. And so for our heroes, they realize this man is on the moon. Because let's not forget, the last time we saw Apocalypse was back in X Factor Endgame, where you had X Factor teaming up with the Inhumans to battle against Apocalypse in the blue area of the moon. And so for our heroes are like, he's there. He has to be there. But now we have to jump back over to Jean Grey and also Strife. Now, this is really important, and let me explain why. Because you had these two characters with a baby. Now, for Cyclops, he's kind of like, this baby looks very similar to Nathan, the son of Cyclops and Madeline Pryor, the same child he had to give up. Let that child go into the future to hopefully save his life. And so for Cyclops, he's kind of like, why is this baby here in the middle of the base of Strife? Now for Jean Grey, she was able to use her powers and realize that this baby is actually a real baby. And the question is right now, How can they save the child's life? Now, you do have Strife up here. He says, listen, if you pull that child out of that device, he is going to die because that device is basically life support for the child. Now, for Strife, he gives our heroes a tough choice here. He says, listen, if you want to save the life of that child, you have to give up your lives as a way to save the life of that child. But if you want to survive, then you have no choice but to go ahead and give up the life of that child to save your own. And so the question is right now, will our heroes be actual heroes here at the moment? And for Cyclops and Jean Grey, they're kind of like, hey, to save the life of this child, we'll go ahead and give up our lives here. But for Strife, that is not the answer at all he wanted. And so he released the Dark Riders to fight against our heroes once again to make sure they could not give up so easily. Now, the last couple pages of this chapter, we do see Jean Grey and Cyclops be sucked through some kind of vortex. And when they go through the actual vortex, they actually end up on the outside of the base of Strife to give us confirmation that yes, currently our heroes are no longer on Earth. They're on the moon, possibly the blue area of the moon where Apocalypse Base used to be at. It's where Strife is working out of at the moment. And so now we have to jump over to X Factor issue number 86, part 10 of this crossover. And we do pick up with Wolverine, Cable, and Bishop contacting the rest of the heroes to inform them that they were able to figure out where Jean Grey and Cyclops were taken to. Like, hey guys, listen, we sat down, we realized that it makes a whole lot of sense that first Strife, he's working out of the base of, well, Apocalypse Moon base. And so it kind of makes sense why Jean Grey was not really able to send any message to the rest of the heroes when it came to her mind. Because Jean Grey is a very powerful telepath. But at the same time, though, she's not really that powerful to send a message across space from the moon over to Earth. And so for our heroes, it kind of makes sense. Now, we're also establishing the whole idea of Wolverine and Jean Grey. Not establishing, really more of re-establishing, because for a while now, it has not really been mentioned the fact that Jean Grey is also madly in love with Wolverine. Now, Cyclops, he comes first, but Wolverine, he's a hard second. And so for Logan, he's kind of like, I didn't realize that she was trying her best to contact me when it came to her psychic abilities. But now I realize that she has been, and now I also know they're on the moon and we have to go there now in a hurry. Now, Wolverine, Storm, and Bishop, they'll go there first. The rest of the X-Men will catch up as soon as they can. Now, for Storm and Havoc, they're going to put together a strike team to go save Cyclops and Jean Grey alongside with Wolverine, Bishop, and also Cable. So for this strike team, you have Havoc, Psylocke, Archangel, Iceman, Polaris, Cannonball, and you also have Storm. So there goes your strike team. Now, Beast, of course, he'll stay behind and continue to hopefully work alongside with Apocalypse to figure out if they're able to save the life of Charles Xavier. Now, I wanted to quickly jump back over to Cyclops and Jean Grey because even though they're technically outside the actual base of Strife and are having a hard time breathing, you have Jean Grey being able to create a force field around them. Now, with that force field, they are able to breathe, but that oxygen is going away very fast. And so for Strife, we see him continue to keep mentioning different things about the idea that he wants to get revenge against both Cyclops and Jean Grey for something they did in the past. And we're kind of like, what is it? And for our heroes, they have to hurry and figure it out before they run out of air. But now I want to jump over to the whole process of Apocalypse trying to save the life of Charles Xavier, because you're going to have everyone freaking out when it comes to this moment right here. Because when it comes to Apocalypse, he does begin to do some work on the actual body of Charles Xavier. Except when it comes to Apocalypse, it kind of seems like he had accelerated the whole entire process of the techno-organic virus inside the body of Charles Xavier. And so for our heroes, they kind of believe that Apocalypse is trying to kill off Charles or at least do something really dark with Charles. Now, for Val Cooper, she believes that Archangel has been tricking the heroes the entire time. She believes they have been tricked because he's not doing anything at all. It's Archangel just standing there, allowing Charles Xavier to go through some kind of process that has been started by Apocalypse. But you have Archangel say no. Like he just stands there kind of like, woman, if you believe that I am not right now trying to kill off Charles Xavier, then you are completely crazy and wild. Like I'm standing here because I know what Apocalypse is doing is gone into the life of Charles Xavier. Now I want to jump back over to Cyclops, Jean Grey, and also Strife. Here's the reason why. Because you have Strife still being that huge jerk where you have all three characters inside the bubble. Now for Strife, he's okay. But for Cyclops and Jean Grey, they're running out of air very quickly here. And he wants them to beg for him to save their lives. But he already knew that these two characters were not going to do that at all. But for him, he still wanted to see them beg for him to save their lives. Now, I want to jump back over to Apocalypse because you have Apocalypse explaining what he did to actually save the life of Charles Xavier. He said, listen, he had to grow the virus into a higher growth stage. And the reason why, because when it comes to the techno-organic virus, it feeds off organic matter. But the problem was for the virus, thanks to Apocalypse, it had grown to a higher, bigger state than it was originally. And for Charles Xavier, even though he does have a lot of organic matter to feed off of, but not enough for a virus that has now been fully grown. And so it looked at Apocalypse as a new source of organic matter to eat. And so it left the body of Charles Xavier trying to go over to Apocalypse. But once it was out of the body of Charles Xavier, you then had Apocalypse being able to actually kill off the virus. So Charles is now saved, but he needs some time to actually rest. Now, to end this chapter, we do jump back over to Wolverine, Bishop, and Cable, who do teleport right over to where the base of Apocalypse used to be at on the moon. Now, when they do arrive, they are surrounded by an army of people who are currently working for Strife. So now for our heroes, if they want to be able to save the life of Jean Grey and Cyclops, they're going to have to fight their way over to Strife, and then most likely fight Strife to save Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, the next chapter does take place in X-Men issue number 16, part 11. Now, we pick up with Bishop, Cable, and also Wolverine, like I said earlier, arriving at the base of Strife. Now, when they do arrive, they are surrounded by his entire force. And so you have our heroes just trying their best to survive. Now, at first, it does look like our heroes might be able to hold their own, but then you have Wolverine get hit hard. And so it does seem like maybe our three heroes are about to meet their end. But then out of nowhere, Havoc's strike team does arrive. So Storm, Havoc, Polaris, Psylocke, Iceman, Archangel, I want to say Rogue as well. You also have Apocalypse there, and they all arrive just in time to help out their team to fight against the forces of Strife. Now, while you have our heroes fighting against Strife's forces, you have Strife watching them. And for Strife, he's kind of like, look at them. Like, look at them fighting for so many different reasons. The way they fight, they have so much diversity in their fighting skills, their fighting purposes. But either way, for Strife, he said it does not matter because by the end of all of this, they're going to realize that I am there tomorrow, that I am going to win. Now, for Strife, he does walk out over to Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, we are continuing to show how powerful Strife is because you didn't have Strife being able to use his telekinesis powers to move the wall so easily around him, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. And he takes them out somewhere else into a different base that's on the moon as well. And so you kind of have to wonder, what is he trying to show Cyclops and Jean Grey? Now, for me personally, like I said earlier, this man has been dropping so many hints of like, hey, I keep calling us family, you father of mutants, mother of mutants, prince of mutants, like I could possibly be your long lost son. Either way, you have Strife take Cyclops and Jean Grey somewhere else. Now, I want to jump back over to Charles Xavier. Here's the reason why. Because you have Beast telling us that Charles Xavier is slowly healing up. But here's the big catch. You see, right now, Charles' body still has a very high temperature, 103. Now, for Beast, he feels like Charles' body is going to heal up properly thanks to Apocalypse. But for Beast, he's very worried about the mind of Charles Xavier. He kind of realized there's something going on inside the mind of Charles. The question is, at the moment, what is Charles going through when it comes to his mind? But getting back over to our heroes, and I guess also Apocalypse as well, you have our heroes begin to go their separate ways as a way to look for Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, really for Apocalypse, he goes on his own. Really for Apocalypse, it's all about the idea of survival of the fittest, because he believes that the weak does not deserve to live, but the strong, they deserve to live and actually lead the weak. And so for Apocalypse, it's kind of like, listen, I gotta prove something. I gotta find Strife and get my look back, basically. And so you have Apocalypse just walk away. Now, for the rest of the X characters, they break up into multiple teams to go look for Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, after a few pages, you did have our heroes being able to realize that Strife has taken Cyclops and Jean Grey out to the surface of the moon. Now, in reality, it may seem like he had taken them possibly to a different base that's also on the moon as well. Now, like I said a moment ago, the whole idea of survival of the fittest, because when we jump back over to Apocalypse, he is confronted by the Dark Riders. Now, the Dark Riders, they're kind of like, hey, Master, it's nice to see you again. So currently, right now, we serve Strife. And because, again, Strife had defeated Apocalypse, survival of the fittest. And so for the Dark Riders, they want to prove that they're actually stronger than their actual old master. And so for Apocalypse, he's all like, okay, you want to do this? You want to use me as the test to see how strong you are? Bring it on. And so you have Apocalypse just run straight towards them for one heck of a battle. But getting back over to the X teams, they were able to figure out that where Strife has taken Cyclops and Jean Grey. And it seems to be a separate base he had on the moon. And so either way, you do have our heroes head over there to hopefully save their teammates. Now, I want to jump back over to Charles Xavier because this is going to begin the cliffhanger I am going to use in this video. Because when we jump over to Charles Xavier, this man, he wakes up. When he wakes up, he's freaking out like he had just went through a lot inside his mind, which honestly, he has gone through a lot when it comes to this crossover. But for Charles Xavier, he looks over at Beast and says, listen, I realize what is happening. The connection between Cyclops, Jean Grey, Cable, and also Strife. They are all connected. They are all connected. And you have to understand, it's all about love and hate. And so that is the moment where you have some of the X characters arrive at the base, the second base that Strife is currently using, where we see Jean Grey and Cyclops just standing there, kind of being stuck in position thanks to Strife. But you did have Cable walk up. Now, when Cable walks up, you have Strife say, come here, Nathan Dayspring. It's time for you and I to have a long conversation, my brother. And it's kind of like, wait a second. Or we are finally about to learn everything about Cable and Strife in this crossover. And so in the next video, we'll cover the final chapter, also the epilogue of the X-Cutioner Song. Okay, so it's time for us to continue our coverage over the X-Cutioner Song. And now we have reached a point where we are going to jump into the final chapter of this crossover, but also going to cover the epilogue as well to kind of get the whole story put together for you guys. So, with the final chapter, we're going to jump over to X-Force issue number 18 to wrap up the main storyline of this amazing crossover. And so, getting into today's video, we actually pick up with Cyclops and Jean Grey currently trapped inside a time vortex that is being used by Strife. Now, really, this is Strife trying to show everyone in the area the entire past of Cyclops and Jean Grey, because it's Strife's trying to say that he is actually the son of Cyclops and Jean Grey. It's him also saying that Cable is most likely a clone of Strife, and that is why Cable is actually around. That Strife is the biological child of Cyclops and Jean Grey, even though when it came to Cyclops, he had his son with Madeline prior. But anyways, moving on. But you do have Strife trying to say that he is the actual son of these two characters. Now, for Strife, he did put up a force field around him, Cable, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. Now, when it came to Cable, he did come to this part of the moon with an actual team of characters: Polaris, Havoc, and also Cannonball. But apparently, when the force field went up, only Cable and Havoc made it through. Polaris and also Cannonball did not make it through. And there is a very good reason why. But either way, for Cable, he says enough is enough. It is time for him to finally take down Strife. And so now we have to jump over to the rest of the X heroes who are on the moon currently. Now, the rest of our X heroes, they are looking for the Dark Riders. Now, the Dark Riders are another group of characters who are basically being used by Apocalypse when it comes to his plans against the world. Now, the Dark Riders, they had actually left Apocalypse's side. Let me explain why. You see, in the earlier chapters of this event, you had Apocalypse fighting against Strife. Now, Apocalypse, he lost that battle big time. And so because of him losing that battle, for the Dark Riders, they're kind of like, our master, Apocalypse, had taught us about the whole survival of the fittest. If you are weak, you do not deserve to live. But if you are strong, you have the right to lead the weak. And so for the Dark Riders, Apocalypse was now weak. And so for Strife, he was their new master, and they had joined his side. And so in an earlier chapter, when our heroes had arrived the moon base of Apocalypse that is currently being used by Strife, well, you had the Dark Riders fight against their old master, Apocalypse. Now, for Apocalypse, he kind of believed that maybe he would be able to take them down. No, he did not. He had apparently lost the battle. And the Dark Riders, they had escaped the moon base to go somewhere else. And we have no idea where they are going. Now, for Psylocke, she informs us that Apocalypse is dying. That's how bad the battle went in the earlier chapter, that apparently he got his butt whooped badly. So he's on the verge of death. And so you have Archangel walk away. Now for Archangel, let's not forget that this man wants to get revenge against Apocalypse for what he has done to him, because Apocalypse had changed Archangel into the Angel of Death. And so for Iceman, he's kind of wondering if he should stop Archangel. But for Bishop, it's kind of like, no, that man has to go handle things on his own. We got to move on without him. Now, when we jump back over to the battle between Cable and also Strife, the battle continues on with Strife winning the actual battle, beating down on Cable badly. Now, for Strife, he's trying to use more examples of the reason why he says he is actually the son of Cyclops and Jean Grey, and Cable must be a clone because the way Cable looks. Because let's not forget, when it came to baby Nathan, he was also infected with the techno-organic virus. Now, when it comes to our two characters, they're not really bringing in the fact that the young baby was actually infected with the virus. But for Cable, we can kind of tell that he has been infected by the techno-organic virus. And the virus has taken over at least half of his body. And so for Strife, that's the reason why he believes that Cable is not the actual son of Cyclops and Jean Grey, because Well, he's half man, almost half machine. But either way, the battle does continue on between the two characters. Now, I want to jump over to Charles Xavier because you have Charles Xavier being able to come out of the techno-organic virus thanks to Apocalypse helping him to actually beat it. But apparently, you have Charles telling everybody that he was able to read the mind of every single person who's on the moon at the moment. And so for Charles, he kind of realized that while reading the minds of all those different people, it kind of showed them the past mistakes they all have made, but also possibly reading the mind of both Cable and also Strife. And with them doing that, he kind of sees that their future is going to be a destiny of failure because they're not going to be able to actually reach their goal. And so because of that, for Charles Xavier, he kind of feels like, what is the purpose for us to continue on to fight for our goals if the future is very dark for the mutant race? Now, I want to jump over to Archangel and also Apocalypse because this is the moment where it seems like Archangel is going to kill off Apocalypse, a man who is soon to be dead very soon. Now, for Apocalypse, let's not forget, he is really big on survival of the fittest. The weak deserve to be killed off. The strong deserve to lead the weak. And right now, Apocalypse, he is the weak. He should be killed off. But for Archangel, it's all like, no, because if I do that, I give you what you want. You wanted me to become your angel of death. You want me to give you a quick death. I am going to deny you in both ways. I will not become a weapon for you. I will not give you a quick death. Instead, I will be my own man. And so you have Archangel just walk away to let Apocalypse have a slow death. But getting back over to the battle between Cable and Strife, we do see that Cable is completely losing to Strife. Now, something I do want to mention is that when it came to Strife, when he put up that force field, he made sure that only people who are actually part of the Summer bloodline would be able to make it through the actual force field. Havoc is the brother to Cyclops, so he is able to make it through the actual force field to get inside the area. And luckily he did because Cable was getting a beat down from Strife. Now you also have Cyclops and Jean Grey also being able to break free to join in the battle. But the problem is the machine that was used to open up the time vortex is falling apart, and that is becoming a huge problem. Now for Cable, he was able to create a device and hand the device over to Cyclops to use. The problem is though, you also have Cable activate his self-destruct system in his body. And so for Cyclops, he's kind of wondering what to do here. Because to Cyclops, he kind of wonders what happened when he pressed the button on the device that Cable had given him, because that device could control the time vortex or it could control Cable's self-destruct system. Either way, you have Cable say, go ahead and press the button now. And so Cyclops, he has no choice. He has to press the button. And so we see the time vortex begin to suck in everything in that area except for Havoc, Polaris, Cannonball, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. Only Cable and Strife get sucked in. But then there's also a huge explosion. And so we're kind of left to believe in the possibility that Cable and Strife have both been killed off thanks to the time vortex and that explosion. Now, for Cyclops and Jean Grey, well, really Cyclops, he begins to believe in the possibility that Cable or Strife could have been his son. But the problem is, he never truly got the answer that he wanted. And so for him, for the next few days, years, months, whatever, he will always think about this moment, wondering if it's actually true that Strife or Cable is actually his son. But the last page of the final chapter of this event is really more being used to set up things to come down the road in later books when it comes to the X-Men, because we jump over to Sinister. Now remember, at the very beginning of this event, he had basically tricked the four horsemen of Apocalypse to go capture Cyclops and Jean Grey. Now, when he did that, he then was able to hand them over to Strife. In return, you have Strife give Sinister some kind of container. And we do learn that inside the container, it had contained, or supposedly had contained, the Summers DNA. Except when it comes to Sinister and also his assistant, when they open up the container, there is no Summer DNA in there at all. It is completely empty. So Sinister got played by Strife. Now the thing was though, for Strife, he had put in some kind of virus hoping to kill Lost Sinister. But because Sinister had his assistant open up the container, the virus only affected him and not Sinister. But for Sinister, he kind of realized that, you know what? He should have known that it was too good to be true, that most likely he was being played by Strife. And so he walks away. So the epilogue is not really being used as a way to wrap up the entire event. Instead, the epilogue is really being used as a way to kind of deal with the feelings of different characters who were really affected by the actual event. So, for example, Archangel. As we saw in the entire event, Archangel had a bloodlust to go after Apocalypse, to kill off Apocalypse for what he had done to him, turning him into the Angel of Death. But as we saw by the end of the actual event, Archangel was no longer really trying to kill off Apocalypse. And so we see Archangel and Beast going to a diner to actually repair it, because this diner is really important to the original 5 X-Men: Cyclops, Iceman, Jean Grey, Beast, and also Angel. Now, the reason why they're going to repair the diner, because in the very beginning of this event, Cyclops and Jean Grey were at that diner when they were attacked by Caliban, and that battle had wrecked the entire place. And so it's Archangel and Beast going out of their way to repair the place, but also is kind of building that bond between the two characters, Beast and Archangel. Now, another character that was truly affected by this event is Rogue. You see, for Rogue, she had lost a battle to one of the members of the Mutant Liberation Front. Now, when she had lost that battle, it really kind of gave Rogue some time to actually think about things, because to her, she's kind of wondering, what is the point of mutants fighting against mutants? Like, yes, the X-Men, their main goal is to hopefully one day achieve the idea of mutants and humans living together in harmony. But for Rogue, she's kind of like, what's the point? Where every single time we get up, we have to fight against our own kind to get rid of the bad people of our kind to kind of help out our goal here. But the problem is, our goal is never truly going to be reached, because we live in a world where humans basically hate mutants for no actual good reason. And so you have Rogue expressing this to Gambit, who walked outside to see how she was doing. Now, the next section, you would believe at first that we're going to focus on Jubilee, but we don't. We actually focus on Charles Xavier, because when it came to Charles, as we saw in the earlier chapters of this event, he was affected by the techno-organic virus. And so with that virus, it did seem like at first he was going to die. Now, for Apocalypse, he was able to save Charles Xavier. The problem is, though, apparently he had gained the ability to walk again. Now, the reason why I say a problem is because this is only going to last for maybe a few hours, and that is it. So by the end of the book, he will lose the ability to walk again. And so for Jubilee, it caught her off guard to see Charles Xavier outside the mansion, but also walking. Now, I want to jump over to Beast and Archangel, because as they're going around continuing to build up the diner in the middle of the night so that no one can truly see them, we kind of see them having this cool bonding moment where we have a flashback where apparently Archangel had hired Beast to write one of the term papers they had to hand over to Charles Xavier. When it came time to turn the paper in, well, Charles said, no, I don't want a physical copy, I want a mental copy, to kind of show that he knew that Archangel had hired Beast, paying him $1,000 to write the actual term paper. And Beast apparently did a good job, but unfortunately, it could not be used because, well, Charles wanted a mental copy. But apparently, Beast had told Charles what Archangel had actually did. And so Beast took the money and then got Archangel in trouble. So it makes for a very funny moment between the two characters. But when we jump back over to Jubilee and also Charles Xavier, it's really more Charles Xavier expressing how much he loves the idea of walking. Because to Jubilee, she kind of feels like with Charles having that big mind of his, having the most powerful mind in the entire planet, being a powerful psychic, that she believed that he no longer cared to actually have the ability to walk again. But then he tells her, like, you don't understand how it feels to once again be able to walk, to feel the grass underneath your feet, like having the ability to not be held by other people around the actual mansion. And so for Jubilee, she now has that understanding. She said, hey, you know what? Let's have some fun before you do lose the ability to walk again. And so she gives Charles Xavier some roller skates to have fun a tad bit more while he has the ability to walk. And so we jump back over to Rogue. Now, earlier, we had established that Rogue was having a hard time dealing with the fact that she does no longer see an actual purpose or reasoning to continue to fight for Charles Xavier's goal. But also for Rogue, she wants to have the ability to have someone just hold her, to comfort her, to hold her in their arms. And for Gambit, he wants to do that. It really shows that Gambit does have feelings for Rogue. The problem is her powers prevents him from being able to actually hold her like he wants to or like she wants to. And when he tries to just grab her shoulder, she freaks out because she knows if he touch her skin, her powers are going to activate. Now, I want to jump back over to Charles Xavier and also Jubilee because you have Jubilee doing a great job showing Charles Xavier the whole life on the edge situation. Like, I'm not saying that roller skating is extremely dangerous, but if you fall down the wrong way, you could get seriously hurt. And so for Charles, he's kind of scared of the idea of falling down, getting hurt. But for Jubilee, it's kind of like, no. That's the point of walking, though. Having the chance to go out there to experience different things. You may get hurt, but you didn't have the ability to get back up again and try to do it right the next time. And so even though roller skating needs a lot of practice and you may fall down over and over again, you still have to get back up and try again to continue to learn how to actually roller skate. It's her saying, like, if you want to have the true feeling of having the ability to walk again, you got to do more than just walk around. Try different things while you still have the ability to walk. Now, I want to jump back over to Archangel and Beast. And here's the reason why. Because you have Archangel and Beast bring up the fact that the old days could have been better. What I mean by that is a lot of times for X-Men fans, the original 5 X-Men were kind of labeled bad because they were canceled in comic books time. But then when it came to giant size X-Men and we got new characters, to a lot of people, the new X-Men were actually better than the old. And so for Beast, it's him saying, like, he hears how the old X-Men were bad, but the good X-Men are better. But for Archangel, it's kind of like, no, I'd rather have the old days again because the old days for me personally were better because I was just a regular guy with regular wings. Now I'm a blue skinned guy with metal wings. It's kind of hard for me to say that the present is better than the old days. But for Beast, he says, let me explain things to you. The old days are there to help us learn from our mistakes, to make us a stronger person in the present time. So yes, the old days may be better in some ways, but at the same time, the present time is better than the old times in certain ways as well. Technically, it's an even match, but we use the old days to continue to learn to make sure we don't make the same mistakes twice, to make us a stronger person in the present time. We also get another page where you have Gambit bring a blanket to wrap around Rogue so that he's actually able to hold her in his arms to give her what she actually wants. And it's kind of this very sweet moment for Gambit. Now, I want to jump back over to Charles Xavier and Jubilee because the ending of this book is actually amazing. Because you have Jubilee and also Charles Xavier just spending the last few minutes of him having the ability to walk. And he thanks her for giving him one heck of a good evening. But as he walks away, he begins to lose the ability to walk again. And so, for Jubilee, she just prays and prays that someone would give her or give him, sorry, just a few more hours, a few more minutes to have the ability to walk at least all the way back over to his wheelchair. But unfortunately, he begins to slowly fall down. And you have Jubilee just go over there to help him and walk him over into the chair. And it kind of shows, like, for Jubilee, it began to show her being more, more mature than she has been in the earlier story arcs that we had done. But this is where we are going to end today's comic book video. So please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, see y'all next time. Later.